Good morning. My name is Robert Rapier. I'm a chemical engineer. I've just come here. I came from Hawaii, but I made a trip to Houston first to the Total Energy USA conference. And certainly you've got to use a vivid imagination from there to imagine a world of increasing oil scarcity, because the message there was everything's fine. The U.S. is headed toward energy independence, and you know, the sky's the limit. So we're gonna tell a little bit different story today. So people always ask me what I do, and Jan mentioned I'm Chief Technology Officer for Merica International. What does that mean? I work for a guy who lives in Hawaii, and I go around and I evaluate technologies for him. But it depends on who is asking me what I do. I actually have 4 paying jobs. Fortunately, they only require about 30 hours a week each. The second one, Managing Editor, Consumer Energy Report, that's where I write mostly. So you can find my articles and stuff at Consumer Energy Report. Beginning of October, I took over as Chief Investment Advisor for the energy strategist for Elliott Gue. That is the most stressful of the jobs, because I have to write to deadlines, and it turns out that people do not like to receive incorrect investment advice. And finally, I'm Director of Research and Technology for Soda Energy Group. This is our consulting group from Consumer Energy Report writers. We've got a lot of expertise in-house there, and we formed a consulting group. So that's the 4th job. So just depending on who asks me what I do, I'll give one of those answers. So the outline of my talk today. I'm going to give an overview and a bit of a review from yesterday, and I'm going to talk about some of the threats besides peak oil. I mean, this conference is about peak oil. It's been covered. I'm not going to talk about it a lot, but I'm going to talk about some clear present threats as a result of our dependence on oil. I'll talk about some of the framework that's necessary for some mitigation solutions, and finally some of the barriers to getting some of those solutions implemented. I did write a book. It's Power Plays. The theme of the book would be there is no free lunch, that every one of our energy options has a cost, and it is important to understand and evaluate those costs as we make different choices on energy options. So, global oil production since 1900 has risen steadily until about 1970, and then we had the OPEC Arab oil embargo, and global production reversed direction for a bit. And then there was the Iran-Iraq war in around 1980, and the revolution in Iran. That reversed production for a bit. So if you were watching production at that time, you may have thought that oil had peaked. I mean, it looked like it had peaked for a few years, and then we got a burst, and we increased production from 60 up to 80 million barrels a day from there. We flattened out for a few years, but as you can see, production has started back up again, and it looks like it may climb for a bit. So we may see production go a little bit higher in a few years. We don't know. What is 85 million barrels a day? I like to think about oil in terms I can visualize. That's Dallas Cowboys Stadium. That's the largest domed stadium in the world. Our oil consumption every day would fill that stadium about 5 times. So that's a lot of oil. The oil that we've consumed up to this point in history would cover the state of California to a depth of over 1 foot, or the state of New York to almost 4 feet. That's a lot of oil, and that's all in the atmosphere now as carbon dioxide. So U.S. oil production peaked in 1970, or if you believe the things that I heard over at Total Energy USA, it hasn't peaked yet. We're just coming up off a valley. But as you can see, production has fallen and risen a couple of times since 1970. So the first time was when Alaska Pipeline started up production, and production reversed direction for a few years, and I will bet that the story then was we're going to exceed the production peak from 1970. A few years, decline started again, and it wasn't arrested until the last couple of years when production started to respond to high oil prices. That resulted in some fracking developments and some marginal oil production becoming economic, and so we saw oil production increase. who do we get our oil from? That's important to me. We get, Canada is our most important supplier of oil, but OPEC as a whole, we get about 40% of our oil from OPEC, and that's going to be part of my story in a bit. Mexico, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia used to be, 10 years ago, was our most important supplier, and they've slid down a little bit. But you can see the OPEC countries all clustered in there in the top. I think I got 15 there. Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Venezuela, Iraq, all important oil exporters for the United States. The cost of these oil imports in 2000 was under 100 million barrels a day. Sorry, $100 billion a year. Right now it's over 350. So this was discussed a little bit yesterday, that the cost of oil imports acts as a stealth tax. I mean, we aren't getting, we're sending this money out of the country and we're not seeing an extra benefit for it. And that is a real weight on our economy, and it's a real strain for us. So a little bit of overview. So I usually kick off this section with a quote from Bob Hirsch, and then I talk about peak oil a little bit. And then I've also talked about the decline in EROI, which Charlie Hall talked about yesterday. So I'm not going to talk about those two. I don't know if oil production has peaked, or oil production is about to peak, or oil production will peak in 10 years. I don't know. You don't know. We think we know. Some people think they know. There are some things we do know, okay? I know this with absolute certainty. Most of the world's remaining proved oil reserves are controlled by OPEC and Russia. And we will be importing oil for a long time. And OPEC and Russia have the ability, regardless of how much oil we produce in the United States, to control oil prices and drive oil prices very high. They could bring us to our knees overnight. This is a serious threat to the U.S. economy, and it's a reason that we need to try to minimize our consumption of oil. It's just a real danger hanging over our heads that this is so out of our control. I mean, when 83% of the world's proved oil reserves are controlled by sometimes hostile forces to the United States, it's very, very dangerous for us, and we need to recognize that. Saudi Arabia, when you make a lot more money, governments spend a lot more money, and so the oil price that they require to balance their budget has gone up and up and up. And so oil prices fall much, you will see OPEC, I think, stand firm to keep those oil prices up. So I don't think it's any news to anybody in here. Oil prices, I do not believe, will ever see $50 a barrel again for any extended period of time. Although I saw an article this morning that's predicted from the shale oil revolution in the U.S. that oil prices will fall back to $50. It's a global market, and we don't control most of that market. Hugo Chavez would like $100 for his oil. He said that a number of times. And there's also the danger that OPEC reserves are overstated. In the early 1980s, OPEC changed changed their quota system, and they based it on the amount of reserves. As you can see, from about 1985, oil reserves in the OPEC countries went up dramatically. And most people don't believe they actually went up like that. And in fact, Kuwait came out and admitted that their reserves were overstated. And so they may not be as great as what is commonly reported and accepted as fact. It's believable that reserves did go up. I mean, reserves can increase over time. The United States reserves at times have increased. So that part is believable. The part that's hard to believe is they went up so dramatically between 1980 and, say, 1987. This was talked about a little bit yesterday. One of the most serious threats to the U.S., our dependence on oil, is the rapid growth in developing countries. So, and this is also a problem for climate change, which I'm going to talk about. You know, in the U.S., we use about 10 times the oil per person that they use in China. There just aren't nearly as many people here in the U.S. But China's oil consumption is increasing. Oil consumption in every developing region in the world is increasing. And the global allotment, if everyone got the same amount of oil, would be about 4.7 barrels per person per year. All of those developing countries are underneath that, and they are coming up. The US is at 22, the EU is about 10, and we've actually been declining in recent years, but not the developing regions. This was a little bit amazing to me. I created a narrative in my head a few years ago that what would happen as oil prices increased is that developing countries would be priced out of the market. That is not what happened at all. What happened was oil demand was almost immune to the price of oil in developing countries. And I finally reasoned why that happens. They use so little oil, and it's so important to them. When you don't have heat and you don't have transportation, $100 a barrel for oil is nothing. I mean, you'll pay more than that. You'll pay a lot more than Europe, pays the equivalent of $300-400 a barrel of oil because of taxes right now. So the price that oil can rise to is much higher, I think, than we think. I mean, we think it can't go much. It went to 147, it retreated. It can ultimately go a lot higher than that as developing countries continue to develop, and if production around the world cannot keep up with that demand. I mean, you look at that demand growth. Oil prices at $100 really did not affect the demand growth in Asia Pacific or in any developing region. This is what the developing regions around the world looked like. The only ones that had negative changes in oil consumption are the developed countries. And the reason for that is, if we use 22 barrels of oil, we're using those 22 barrels to be able to drive 12,000 miles a year and to have all kinds of conveniences and big cars and so forth and so on. It is very easy for us to shave a little bit of that fat off. It's not so easy for a starving person to shave fat off. And that's why you see consumption going up in those developing regions, even at these oil prices, and consumption declining in the developed regions. So very little discussion here about climate change. It was a little bit surprising to me. There was no discussion of climate change at the Total Energy USA conference. I'm sure there are people in here that are skeptical of climate change, that man is contributing to climate change. I believe that we are contributing to climate change. I'm not a climate scientist either, but from what I view, from what I've read, it is a human caused problem, or at least humans are contributing to it. But no matter what your position, a graph like that should be troubling. That is, not only are carbon emissions increasing, they're accelerating. I mean, if you look at any period, 1960, 1970, 1980, 1990, that curve is going up. And so at some point, this becomes a problem. If you don't believe it's a problem now, I mean, you have to extrapolate that out a little bit more, and you see it could potentially be a problem, even if you're a skeptic of climate change. The bad part about it is, again, because oil consumption has gone down in North America and the European Union, and because we've been switching out coal-fired power to natural gas, our carbon emissions, this is percentage of global CO2 emissions, but our absolute emissions are declining as well. The U.S., the IEA reported last year that the U.S. had the largest decrease in carbon emissions of any region in the world over the past 3 or 4 years. But Asia Pacific, for instance, is growing rapidly. They're building so many coal-fired power plants, their oil consumption is increasing. And what that means is our ability to impact climate change, and if you don't like climate change, let's just say CO2. Our ability to affect the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere is declining over time. And so a lot of people ask me, what is the solution? What was the solution when Hurricane Katrina was bearing down on New Orleans? How do you stop that hurricane? And the answer is you don't. I don't see any solution to that. You got people in India and China who are using 1 or 2 barrels per person per year. We're using 22, but currently they are the problem. They are going to contribute more to CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. The historical emissions are ours. The inventory up there belongs to the US. Going forward, it's going to belong more and more to China and India. So what do you do about that? How do you tell a starving person you need to go on a diet? Very, very difficult. And somebody suggests to me with all seriousness that this is worth a war with China over to stop their carbon emissions. We're not in a position, certainly not in a moral position, to tell them they can't burn more carbon. So very, very difficult problem. I don't know the answer to this. I think about this a lot. I honestly think the real answer is we just cope with it. I told a friend, my solution is hope. And he said, "You're not a hope kind of guy." And I said, "I know, but I don't know what else to do. I don't see a solution on the horizon." So if our oil dependence is a problem, or at least a threat, and I believe it is a threat because there's so many things we don't control. Certainly oil does great things for our economy. Certainly it allows us to have a lot of GDP, but we are by far the leader in GDP per barrel of oil produced, so we can get a lot more efficient there. But if you believe our oil dependence is a problem, there are some things we can do to mitigate that dependence. So a sound energy policy, what does it need? You need to think about the supply side, the demand side, and the possibility that either or both are wrong. You need to factor in how this impacts future generations, and it needs, the third one is most important, it needs to be capable of weathering changing political climates. So we have a turnover in Congress every couple of years, and so we get new energy policies constantly. And the problem is that those political cycles are so much shorter than energy cycles that it's hard to do long-term projects when policy is changing a lot. I came out of the oil industry, and that was a big problem for us, that a lot of times we could not long-term plan a project because there was just so much uncertainty. It's not only a problem in the oil industry, the wind industry has this problem. They take the credit, they give it, they take it, and so any project that takes 3 or 4 years, you're very, very cautious about that project, and it keeps projects from getting done. So what do we want as consumers, as citizens? We want energy that's affordable, reliable, convenient, safe, clean, and nowhere near us. That's what we want. So fossil fuels, we know they're not always safe or clean. Nuclear power, I personally am in favor of nuclear power. I think ultimately we're going to need it. If China was, if China went entirely to nuclear power instead of coal-fired power, that would make a big difference in global CO2 emissions. But we've seen the occasional calamity from nuclear power plants, and we have to take that seriously and not downplay it and say that's a fluke. I suspect most of us, even if we're for nuclear power, don't want a nuclear power plant close to us. We've seen people have to pick up and move and leave everything behind. And I suspect the people in the shadow of Fukushima, you probably won't find too many fans of nuclear power there. I mean, they lost their homes. Chernobyl people lost their homes, and so we have to think about that as we develop nuclear power. I think it can be done safely, but we have to take those safety considerations into account. Renewable fuels, not always affordable or convenient, and we know there's externalities there about land use, about food versus fuel, and renewable electricity, not always cheap, reliable, or safe. So what usually wins is affordability. We really want, at the end of the day, we want to be able to afford energy. So we put up with things like this, and that is, we blame the oil companies for this, but it's our demand that causes things like this. But even clean energy, there's a story about Spain and the wind turbines there, killing 6 to 18 million birds and bats every year. So that's not an indictment against wind, but it just shows they all have a price. Even solar power has a price. They all cost something. There is no free lunch. And given that, we have to clearly understand what these trade-offs are. If we wanted to go to 100% biofuels in the U.S., which I don't believe is possible, we would need to understand what those trade-offs would be. Second point, always keep in mind, when somebody comes with a new energy solution to all of our problems, what seems to be good, what seems to be too good to be true is too good to be true 99.9% of the time. I tried to think of a time that somebody brought me a technology and I said, this is really better than you said it was. This is better than I thought it was. I can't think of a time that happened. So maybe 0.1% of the time things are better than they seem. But most of the time somebody tells you a great, fantastic story about a car that runs on water or so forth and so on. It's too good to be true. Politicians in general do not understand the energy markets, so when they meddle, they usually make matters worse. So it's important to have a framework in place, a consistent framework, but that they are not trying to pick winners and losers. It's also important to keep in mind the political realities are that people will vote out politicians that ask them to sacrifice. So as you're framing solutions to our oil dependence, we have to keep that in mind. We have to keep in mind that people are not always rational. They are not always thinking about future generations, and that has to be a part of any framework for any sort of solutions that we put out. So what are some barriers then to getting solutions in place? Here's the energy transitions in the U.S. Over the past couple hundred years. So wood gave rise to coal, and then petroleum came along, then we got natural gas and nuclear power, so we always had something better coming along. And so that is the expectation now. Oil gives way to the next best thing. We just don't know what that is yet, but people expect the next magical solution to come along. This slide is very, very counterintuitive, but I've got it up there for a reason. The political expectations, okay, if you look at it, when Bush was in office, oil production fell for 8 straight years. And Bush is a known oil man. We know he's sympathetic to the oil industry. For Obama, for the first time since LBJ, oil production has gone up for 4 straight years. So what does that mean? The average person might look at that and say, well, that means Obama's energy policies were more beneficial to the oil industry. It's not what it means at all. It means there's a lag in a cause and an effect. So oil prices went up in 2005. Oil companies started making a lot of investments. Fracking developments happened, and Obama just came in when that turned up. If you look, the decline was slowing down in Bush's last year in office. It's not a result of Bush, it's not a result of Obama, it's a result of oil prices. The truth is, presidents do not have very much impact on the oil and gas markets. In the long term, they can push through certain policies that help a little or hurt a little, but mostly it's price. So as I said earlier, energy cycles are a lot longer than political cycles, but here is a time that a president actually did impact on oil production in the U.S. President Nixon in 1973 authorized the Alaska pipeline, but oil production had peaked. It continued to decline under his administration. Carter got the benefit. Carter came into office, the Alaska oil pipeline opened up in 1977, and oil production rose for a few years. And so the problem with politics is people take credit for things that they don't deserve. Obama, earlier this year, he said his energy policy was validated because for the first time in 40 years, oil production has gone up for 4 straight years. So that validates his energy policy. And people don't understand enough about the lag and so forth, and that may be a believable story. And you get people in that, for example, Obama and Democratic administration over the last 4 years, the policies they put in place, they can point to that. They can say, look, oil production has gone up, so therefore we need to continue what we're doing. And that's not a criticism of Obama and his energy policy. It's just a fact that people are coming in and things are happening that were a result of things that happened 2, 4, 6, 8 years ago. And so sometimes we make incorrect decisions because the signals are wrong. The biggest barrier of all is apathy. I mean, people don't care. People don't care about energy. They care about how much they're paying for their electric bill. They care how much they're paying at the gas station. But you personally, I mean, there are things you personally can do, and people ask me what they can do. You can reduce your own oil dependence. I mean, I talk to my family about this. I talk to my friends about it. You reduce your own oil dependence, and you can do that without making too many sacrifices. And you can educate friends, family, and the person standing next to you at the bus stop or on the airplane about this issue. I can thank Matt Simmons and Jim Kunstler for doing that for me. I wouldn't be here today if not for having read their books and becoming really terrified about what the future could look like. And that's what got me involved. That's what got me started writing. I've been in the energy business for a while, but the fear of what could happen as a result of our oil dependence really concerned me, and so I decided to get involved. With that, that's it. Yep. Great.